In March 2021, a religious studies teacher at a school in West Yorkshire showed his Year 9 class a cartoon during a lesson about free expression and blasphemy. The cartoon had originally appeared in Charlie Hebdo. Within 2 days, there were protests at the school gates. He was suspended. The head teacher apologized unequivocally. The teacher received death threats. He left his home with his partner and 4 children and moved to a secret address. 2 months later, an independent investigation cleared him of any intent to cause offense and told him he could have his job back. He did not go back. He is still in hiding. 5 years later, in a country of 68 million people, a schoolteacher cannot go home because of a picture he showed in a lesson about pictures. And here is the part that should stop you cold. In France, an almost identical sequence had ended 6 months earlier with Samuel Paty being beheaded on a street in a Paris suburb, and France responded by rewriting its constitutional relationship with Islam. Britain had its own version, watched the same warning, and did essentially nothing. To understand why, you have to look at what Britain built instead, because Britain did not ignore this problem. It studied it more thoroughly than almost anyone. It just kept refusing to reach a conclusion. Start with the difference in architecture, because everything else follows from it. France runs laïcité, a doctrine that pushes religion out of public space entirely. Britain has an established church, whose supreme governor is the monarch, with 26 bishops sitting in the House of Lords as of right. Britain funds faith schools directly from the taxpayer, thousands of them, mostly Anglican and Catholic, but also Jewish, Muslim, Sikh, and Hindu. Religious symbols in schools are broadly permitted. There is no headscarf ban, no abaya ban, no minaret ban, no face covering ban. A Muslim woman can wear a niqab into a British courtroom, a hospital, a school, or parliament, and in almost every case, the law protects her right to do so. That is not an oversight. It is a doctrine, and it has a name in British political usage: state multiculturalism. The theory was that a diverse society is best governed by recognizing groups rather than dissolving them, by working through community leaders, funding community organizations, and allowing communities substantial autonomy over their own internal life. Britain adopted this deliberately, and for decades it was regarded as the sophisticated alternative to French assimilationism. Where France told arrivals to become French, Britain told them they could remain what they were and be British as well. British Muslims number roughly 4 million today, close to 7% of the population, concentrated in London, Birmingham, Bradford, Manchester, and the northern mill towns, and drawn overwhelmingly from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India, rather than from North Africa or Turkey. That origin matters, because it meant the community arrived with existing institutional structures, mosque networks, and biradari kinship politics, that mapped neatly onto exactly the kind of group representation the British model was built to accommodate. Then, on July 7, 2005, 4 British-born men detonated bombs on 3 underground trains and a bus in central London, killing 52 people and injuring more than 700. The oldest was 30. The youngest was 18. One of them was a teaching assistant. One left a video explaining himself in a broad Yorkshire accent, telling the country he had grown up in that he considered himself at war with it. That accent is the whole problem in a single detail. These were not infiltrators. They were the output of the system that was supposed to be working, and they had been formed inside the most accommodating framework for Muslim life in Europe. Everything Britain has done in this area since is downstream of that morning and of the question it forced. What do you do when the model of tolerance you are proudest of produces the people trying to kill you? So Britain built PREVENT. And this is the mechanism, so it is worth being precise, because PREVENT is the single most consequential and most misunderstood counter-extremism program in Europe. PREVENT is one of 4 strands of the British counter-terrorism strategy, and its stated purpose is to stop people becoming terrorists before they commit any offense. It operates through a legal duty. Since 2015, teachers, doctors, nurses, university lecturers, social workers, prison officers, and local council staff have all been under a statutory obligation to have due regard to the need to prevent people being drawn into terrorism. In practice, this means that if a professional sees something concerning, they refer the person. A panel reviews the referral. If it meets the threshold, the person is adopted into a program called Channel, which provides mentoring, theological engagement, psychological support, and practical intervention. Understand what is genuinely radical about this. It is not policing. Nobody is arrested. No crime is alleged. It is a pre-criminal intervention system embedded in the everyday professions of a country, and it processes several thousand people a year. Nothing on this scale exists anywhere else in Europe. France closes buildings. Germany bans organizations. Austria raided 60 addresses in one morning. Britain built a permanent nationwide referral pipeline running through every school and hospital in the country, and it has been running for over a decade. And it produces a set of numbers that nobody in Britain can agree about. In the year to March 2022, there were 6,406 referrals to prevent. 20% concerned far-right extremism, 16% concerned Islamist extremism. Around a third fell into a category labeled mixed, unstable, or unclear. Now set that against a different set of figures the government also publishes. 80% of live counter-terrorism police investigations concern Islamist terrorism. MI5 has said Islamist extremism accounts for around 75% of its caseload. So the referral system produces 16% Islamist, while the intelligence services say the actual threat is roughly 75 to 80% Islamist. That gap is the entire British argument, and both sides read it in exactly opposite directions. One reading says the gap proves institutional failure. Teachers and doctors, terrified of being called Islamophobic, are simply not making the referrals they should be making, so the pipeline underreports the thing that is actually killing people. The other reading says the gap proves the system is working exactly as designed. Prevent is supposed to catch people early, before anyone reaches an MI5 caseload, and a healthy early warning system should look nothing like a list of active terrorist investigations. If it did, it would mean the state was only noticing people once they were already dangerous. Both of those are coherent. Neither can be tested because you cannot count the attacks that did not happen. And that is the permanent condition of British policy on this subject. An enormous apparatus, an unfalsifiable argument about whether it works, and a political class that keeps commissioning reports rather than deciding. Now the reviews, because Britain's characteristic response to this subject is not a law. It is a commissioned report. In April 2014, Prime Minister David Cameron ordered a review of the Muslim Brotherhood. He appointed Sir John Jenkins, at the time Britain's ambassador to Saudi Arabia, working with Charles Farr from the Home Office's Office for Security and Counter-Terrorism. Jenkins visited 12 countries, met governments, religious leaders, academics and Brotherhood representatives, and had access to material from Britain's intelligence agencies. The review was completed by the end of July 2014. It was then not published for 17 months. When it finally emerged on December 17, 2015, it was not the report. It was a document called The Main Findings, and it appeared on the last sitting day of the Commons before the Christmas recess, which is where governments put things they would prefer nobody dwell on. The full report has never been released. Cameron told a parliamentary committee it could not even be published in redacted form because it contained material given in confidence by foreign governments, and that material ran throughout. The findings themselves were carefully balanced in a way that satisfied nobody. Cameron said parts of the Muslim Brotherhood had a highly ambiguous relationship with violent extremism, and that as both an ideology and a network, it had been a rite of passage for some individuals who went on to violence. He described the organization as deliberately opaque and habitually secretive, and he concluded that membership of, association with, or influence by the Brotherhood should be considered a possible indicator of extremism. Then he announced the consequences. Visas would be refused to Brotherhood members with a record of extremist comments. Charity regulation would be tightened. Scrutiny would be intensified. That was it. No ban, no prescription, no dissolution power. Britain conducted the most thorough state investigation of the Muslim Brotherhood ever undertaken by a Western government, concluded it was ambiguous about violence and habitually secretive, and then issued a visa policy. The Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Commons examined the review and was unimpressed, and not in the way you might assume. It was refused access to the full report twice, even under controlled conditions, and called the ministerial explanations for that refusal threadbare and the reasoning behind the review opaque. Jenkins himself declined to give evidence to the committee, and the committee raised something more awkward still. appointing Britain's ambassador to Saudi Arabia to lead a review of an organization that Saudi Arabia had designated as terrorist-created, in the committee's words, the perception that an interested foreign state had a private window into a British government inquiry. The committee was careful to say it had seen no evidence that Saudi Arabia actually influenced the outcome, but it said the appointment had undermined confidence in the impartiality of the work. There was reporting at the time that MI5 had opposed the review being conducted at all. So the most important British document on political Islam is one that Parliament cannot read, written by a diplomat who would not testify about it, published on the last day before Christmas, and criticized by a conservative-chaired committee for creating the appearance of foreign influence. That is not a country that failed to investigate. That is a country that investigated and then could not agree on what it had found, or even who was allowed to see it. If you want more of the stories where the most important thing a government does is decline to act, subscribe to Fall of Nations. Because Britain then ran the exact same process a second time on its own flagship program, and the result was worse. The pattern repeated with Prevent. In January 2019, the government announced an independent review due by August 2020. The first appointed reviewer, Lord Carlisle, had to be dropped over his previous advocacy for the program. In January 2021, William Shawcross was appointed instead, and his appointment prompted a boycott by a long list of civil society organizations, largely on the basis of remarks he had made years earlier about Islam in Europe. The review was finally published on February 8, 2023, roughly 30 months late and repeatedly leaked in the interim. Its central argument was that Prevent had lost focus. Shawcross said it was not doing enough about non-violent Islamist extremism, that it had shown what he called cultural timidity and an institutional hesitancy to tackle Islamism for fear of being called Islamophobic, and that challenging extremist ideology should extend beyond prescribed organizations to domestic extremists operating below the terrorism threshold, who create an environment conducive to terrorism. He also found that several Prevent-funded organizations had themselves promoted extremism or engaged with extremists. He made 34 recommendations. Home Secretary Suella Braverman accepted all of them. And now the counter case, which is substantial and has to be stated properly. Critics pointed out that Shawcross's core statistical claim does not survive contact with the channel figures. Yes, 16% of referrals were Islamist against 20% far-right. But of the referrals actually escalated into channel, the intensive program reserved for the most serious cases, roughly 42% were far-right and 19% Islamist. In other words, the professionals assessing individual cases were judging the far-right referrals more serious more often. Amnesty International called the review deeply prejudiced and said it had no legitimacy. And the wider criticism of Prevent itself is not fringe. Referral thresholds are extraordinarily low. There are documented cases of very young children being referred over things they said that were plainly misunderstood, including a 4-year-old whose remark about guns and bombs turned out to be about a video game. Only around 13% of referrals are adopted as channel cases at all, which means the overwhelming majority of people put through this system were never assessed as a genuine risk by anyone. And the Manchester Arena Inquiry, reporting after the Shawcross review, placed the failure over that attack with the security services rather than with local Prevent delivery. Both sides of this are describing something real, which is precisely why it never resolves. Britain has a system that catches thousands of people who turn out to be nothing, while missing the ones who go on to kill. In May 2017, a suicide bomber killed 22 people, many of them children, at a concert in Manchester. He had been referred to Prevent. In November 2019, a man who had been through a de-radicalization program and was attending an offender rehabilitation conference at Fishmongers Hall in London stabbed 2 people to death. In October 2021, the MP Sir David Ames was murdered at a constituency surgery in Essex by a man who had been referred to Prevent in 2014. And underneath the reviews and the referral statistics sits the thing Britain has never resolved at all, which is what happens at street level when a community decides something is unacceptable. Batley is the clearest case, and the official verdict on it is damning in a way that has nothing to do with Islam. Dame Sarah Khan, the government's independent advisor on social cohesion, examined it and found the teacher had been let down by every agency involved: the council, the police, and the Academy Trust. He was not treated as a victim of crime. He received none of the entitlements set out in the victim's code. She recorded that he had been left suicidal and suffering post-traumatic stress. There was a considerable lack of leadership, she wrote, and the agencies should have made clear that threats and harassment would not be tolerated. They did not. The school apologized for the lesson before establishing any facts. Nobody was arrested at the protests. And the effect spread outward exactly as you would expect. A YouGov survey of over 1,100 teachers commissioned by Policy Exchange found that 19% of English and art teachers had self-censored to avoid causing religious offense after Batley. 55% said they would not use any image of the Prophet Muhammad in a classroom under any circumstances, rising to 64% among art teachers. A former education secretary called it a national disgrace that the teacher was still in hiding. Britain has no blasphemy law. England and Wales abolished the offense in 2008. What Batley demonstrated is that you do not need one. You need a crowd at a school gate, an employer who apologizes first, and a police force that treats the whole thing as a community relations problem rather than a criminal one. Now put the two cases side by side, because the comparison is the reason this video exists. Samuel Paty and the Batley teacher taught the same subject. Both showed the same cartoons from the same magazine in a lesson about the same topic: free expression. Both were named and targeted through an online campaign that began with a parental complaint. Both had crowds arrive at their school. One was murdered in the street in October 2020. The other went into hiding in March 2021, 5 months later. France responded to its case by prosecuting the people who built the chain, convicting 8 of them, including the parent who started the campaign and the preacher who amplified it. It passed the separatism law. It closed mosques. Whatever you think of any of that, France treated Paty's death as an attack on the state itself. Britain responded to its case by suspending the teacher, apologizing for the lesson, making no arrests, commissioning a report from an independent advisor that concluded every agency had failed him, and then implementing essentially none of what that finding implied. The teacher is still gone. The people who threatened him were never identified. And a majority of British art teachers have quietly concluded they will not go near the subject again. That is the difference between the two models expressed in a single pair of events, and it does not flatter either of them. So set Britain against the others, and the comparison is genuinely uncomfortable in both directions. France, Austria, Denmark, and Switzerland all took decisive action, and in every case something pushed back: a court, a regulator, a European judgment, a backlash. Britain took almost no decisive action of that kind, and so has almost nothing to be struck down. There is no British minaret ban to overturn, no mass raid ruled unlawful, no fine from a data protection authority, no European court judgment against it on this subject. On the metric of not doing anything you later have to undo, Britain is the most successful country in this entire series. And on the metric that actually matters, it is not obvious that it has achieved anything at all. It reviewed the Muslim Brotherhood more comprehensively than any other Western state and produced a visa policy that Parliament was not permitted to read the reasoning for. It built the largest pre-criminal intervention system in Europe, and then spent a decade arguing about whether it is pointed at the right people, an argument that 2 official reviews have failed to settle. And it allowed a school teacher to be driven out of his home by threats, with no arrests, no meaningful state protection, and a majority of art teachers concluding they will simply never touch the subject again. That is what caution actually costs, and Britain's caution is not cowardice. It is a genuine judgment, made repeatedly by governments of both parties, that a country with an established church, state-funded faith schools, and 4 million Muslim citizens cannot start banning things without becoming a different country, and that the French approach buys decisive action at a price Britain is not willing to pay. That judgment might well be right. But Britain has now spent a decade demonstrating that the alternative to acting is not neutrality. It is a slow accumulation of things nobody will say out loud, enforced not by the state but by whoever is willing to turn up and shout. So we want to hear from you. Is Britain the adult in the room? the one country that looked hard at this, understood that bans and raids generate backlash and legal defeat, and deliberately chose not to break its own constitutional settlement over it? Or is Batley the whole answer, and has Britain simply outsourced the drawing of its limits to whoever is prepared to threaten a teacher while producing reports that nobody is allowed to read? Tell us in the comments, we read them. And if you want the stories underneath the headlines, subscribe to Fall of Nations. Because the full Jenkins report is still classified, 5 years after Parliament asked for it, and nobody has explained what is in it.